Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. From the right, I'm Gary Polland.
And from the left, I'm David Jones.
Tonight we welcome the author of Courage and Consequence, My Life as a Conservative in the Fight, Karl Rove. I call Karl King Karl. Welcome, Your Honor.
That's an old nickname. That's been back when they used to hunt Republicans in Texas with dogs when you gave me that nickname.
That is absolutely true.
Right.
Karl, I just want to know, did you have anything at all to do with him getting to be chairman of the party? Because otherwise, you and I will get along well.
No. He was a big power back then, and now he spends his time trying to hold you off. I mean, what thus far the decline. I mean,
okay, so this book, I have to tell you, even though I don't read the personal side of people's autobiographies. Yeah. The rest of it is fascinating. Yeah. And please introduce us to Barack Obama and the story at the end of the book where you met him for the first time.
Well, I met him when he was elected to the United States Senate because he would come to the White House and we'd hang out together because we have mutual friends. Ken Mellman, who ran the 2004 Bush campaign, was his Harvard classmate, as were two of my White House colleagues, Kathy Martin and Kevin Martin. Kevin was the head of the FCC. So,
but you had a run-in with him.
Well, we did, because one day, and we'd hang around, so we had a cordial relationship. One day in 2007, my deputy, Barry Jackson, came in and said, "Do you know you're in his book, Audacity of Hope?" I said, "No, I had no idea." He said, "Yeah, you're in there. He's got you saying, quote, 'we're a Christian nation.'" And look, it's one thing to say we prize the First Amendment, we're a nation that derives much from the Judeo-Christian ethic, but you have somebody saying, quote, "we are a Christian nation." What happened to the Jews? What happened to the non-believers? What happened to the Muslims? What happened to the skeptics? I mean, that's one of the great things about being an American.
You took it as an insult.
Well, and not only that, but I never said it. I mean, he said he had my name, the word "say," and something in quotes. So I stuffed it in my pocket and forgot about it. And didn't remember that Senator Obama was coming to the White House later in the day. So I'm getting ready to go down and get a cup of coffee from the White House mess. I'm walking down. There's only 2 stairwells in the West Wing, and it's sort of a little place to begin with. And I'm walking down, and Senator Obama's walking up. So we stopped in the hallway and chit-chat for a couple of seconds. And after a few seconds, I said, "Hey, I understand I'm in your book." He said, "No, I don't think you are." And I said, "No, I understand I'm in your book, and you got me saying we're a Christian nation. Where did I say that?" He said, "Oh, no, I don't have you saying that." I said, "No, wait a minute. You got my name and the word 'say' and something in quotes, and people are going to think I said it. So where did I say that exactly?" And he said, "Oh, no, I remember. You got it all wrong. I don't imply that you said it." So I said, "Really?" And I pulled it out and showed it to him, and I got the sort of like in the stairwell. No apology, but clearly unsettled him that I had caught him in attributing to me something I didn't say.
The funniest part, though, was whenever you're at the banquet.
Yeah, a year later.
Seated with one of his right-hand
senior
people.
staff, Valerie Jarrett. A year later, White House Correspondents' Dinner. I'm there at the Newsweek table. I write for Newsweek. And I'm there with John Meacham, the editor, and Valerie Jarrett. And during the dinner, she blackberries Obama and says, "I can't believe it, I'm having dinner with Satan himself, Karl Rove."
And she showed you that.
Well, he emailed her back, and she made the mistake of showing the response to the email to both Meacham and me, which was said basically from Obama saying, "He probably hates me for something I said in my book, and he's got every right to feel that way." And I told her, I said, "I don't hate." But to me, it's an interesting lesson because I just recently saw footage where Obama said in 2006 in a speech, quote, "Karl Rove doesn't believe in government. I'm some kind of anarchist then." And what I didn't know in the book is a page or two later, he refers to me as a 1960s radical. Well, wait a minute. I don't remember trying to bomb a government building like his buddy Bill Ayers, or saying "God, America" like the guy in whose pew he sat for 20 years, or saying, "I'm proud of my country for the first time when I'm 40. I mean, it was interesting that this proponent of a new style of politics could so easily insult somebody and impugn their integrity by suggesting that they said things they never said.
Well, you can make it up to him right now by saying, announcing your approval of this first year, which you have to be impressed with a first year of a president who passes the most important piece of domestic legislation since LBJ.
The first
has
piece,
a nuclear. Oh
no! Wait a minute!
Gives a message to the Muslims in Cairo, which sends a message that things are different in this country now.
First of all, this is the first major piece of social legislation passed on a strictly partisan basis. Republicans and Democrats came together to pass Social Security, Medicare, civil rights, welfare reform, education reform. This is the first piece of legislation passed on a straight party vote, and it's his responsibility for doing that. As to nuclear weapons, do you think it's a big thing to drop nuclear weapons from the U.S. stockpiles from 6,000 to 1,500 weapons? Do you think that's a big deal?
I'm talking about his impressive first year.
No, I'm just asking a straight question.
He put Hispanic on the Supreme Court.
You think it's a big thing to drop the nuclear stockpiles in the United States from 6,000 to 1,500?
He had a tough time, Carl, with an economy that was in free fall.
You know what?
Do you approve of the stimulus that saved this economy?
Oh, no, the stimulus has not created any jobs. It's a waste of money.
Well,
My point, let me go back to this other point, though. President Bush is the person who reduced the nuclear stockpiles in the United States from 6,000 to 2,200. It's President Obama who's reduced them from 2,200 to 1,500. I am certain, David, you were out there singing hosannas when President Bush provided the international leadership in saying to the Russians, we will reduce our stockpiles, and I challenge you to follow our lead, which is what they did in dropping the size of our nuclear stockpiles and theirs from 6,000 weapons to 2,200. That's a big achievement. And President Obama ought to be applauded for getting it from 2,200 to 1,500. But again, I didn't see very many liberals out there applauding Bush when he did that, and which was terrific leadership.
They never applauded Bush.
Yeah, no, of course they did.
Let's switch topics and talk about your book.
And first year, disaster.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Actually, he didn't pass anything his first year.
You didn't make up to the
because this
president.
is March.
You had your chance to make up.
Here's what I have said, David, and if you read my columns in the Wall Street Journal, you'd see this. I applauded him on Iraq. He did the right thing. It took him a long time to come to the right decision in Afghanistan, but he did the right thing. He's doing the right thing in saying that we ought to link teacher performance to teacher pay. He's doing the right thing by taking the Bush policy in the Persian Gulf and continuing to provide defensive military systems to our allies there and expanding the U.S. military presence. He also did the right thing by renewing the Patriot Act, which he had earlier in this campaign led people to believe he might not renew, but it was the right thing to do. Having become president, he understood how valuable
So you see,
a tool this
everything
was.
Obama's done right, he's carried on the great policies that Bush did, David. Okay. Rovian-style campaigning. And when I look at the campaigns that you've been involved in, I think it's first fair to say that you are the visionary who planned or envisioned how the Republicans could become ascendant in Texas, number one. Number two, I thought the two campaigns that I focus on that are most telling in terms of how you ran campaigns was 1994 and 2000. 94 when Bush gets elected governor over Ann Richards, who was a very popular incumbent. In 2000 when Governor Bush took on Vice President Al Gore, sitting vice president behind a president who had issues but still was pretty popular.
Yeah, look, in 2000, a group of academic forecasters held a conference in Washington in the fall of 2000 and forecast that Al Gore would get between 55% and 65% of the two-party vote. One Republican who actually chaired the conference, a buddy of mine named Jim Campbell from SUNY Buffalo, I think he forecast Bush would get no more than 48% of the two-party vote. Sponge out all the third-party candidates and look at the two-party vote. But, both of the campaigns shared something in common, which was they were running uphill, and they had to be won by creating an image of what somebody was for, not what somebody was against. You could not beat Ann Richards by simply saying I'm against her. You had to say, here are the challenges the state faces. Then here's what I'm going to do about them. And the same in 2000. We could not run by simply saying, you know what, we're not going to be those guys. We had to lay out an optimistic and positive vision for the country's future.
So for the Republicans going forward, 2010, what should be the Republican vision going into this? Could be a nationalized fall campaign.
Well, look, they will have an enormous wave of discontent with Obama because contrary to what David's belief is, a lot of independents and some Democrats and a lot of Republicans are not happy about the first year and a few months of the Obama administration. And in the 31 weeks left, there's going to be that wave. It's not enough, though, and the Republicans have got to go out and lay out a positive and optimistic agenda and talk about the things people are concerned about. It's not simply enough to say, this is a bad bill on health care. They need to say, here are the things that we want to do in order to make health coverage more affordable and more accessible to more Americans. If they do that, they'll be in good shape, but they've got to do it.
I'm taking that the book, and much of what I've read in any event, is very supportive of the administration where you worked. I mean, you got President Bush.
I believe in what we did. Yeah.
I understand. Yeah. And I'm wondering whether or not you're worried, though, about the judgment of history as you try to make your case, given that it was predicted that, President Bush was not the best prepared man for the office.
Wait a minute. He'd been governor of chief executive of a very large state. He hadn't been a state senator and been a freshman member of the United States Senate who has no legislative accomplishments. He had been a successful business person and governor of the second largest state in the union. I disagree with your assumption.
He didn't stop drinking till he's 40. He didn't do anything that his father didn't help him do.
Oh, please, David, with all due respect.
Did he not have some wealth and some friends behind him?
David, with all due respect, these are the old myths. First of all, I was there. He applied for Harvard Business School and was accepted, and his parents knew about it for the first time when he got accepted at Harvard. He launched out on his own because he wanted to develop his own. His dad didn't pick up the phone when he was president of the United States and call up Eddie Childs, the owner of the Texas Rangers, and say, you know what, the guy you ought to sell to is my son.
Well, he didn't have to. All he has to do is walk in the door.
Well, with all due respect.
I'm making the case for Karl Rove being the architect.
No, with all due respect, diminishing George W. Bush is a hobby, a lazy hobby of liberals, and you shouldn't fall into that habit, David. You're much better than that. Well, But
the record you have to worry about, which is why you write a book such as what you wrote, is that Bush squandered the surplus of the Clinton years.
No, he didn't.
The economy was in free fall when you left.
David, with all due respect,
remember
those projections about the economy, about the deficits and about the surpluses are in July of 2000, before as the tech bubble is bursting. If you recall, when we came into office, we were handed a recession as the stock market, the NASDAQ dropped 50% between March of 2000 and when we took office, and the New York Stock Exchange dropped a quarter, and the economy was in recession about the moment Bush took office. And you didn't see him spend his first 6 months going out there wringing his hands and saying, woe is me, here's what I've been handed. What he did was he cut the taxes and grew the economy. When we came into the office, the size of the American economy was $9.7 trillion, annual size of the economy. When we left office, it was $14.2 trillion, a $4.5 trillion growth in the size of the economy. That's equal to the entire Japanese economy. We had 52 months of consecutive job growth. Never in America's history recorded job growth have we had a period of time that long in growing the economy. And why did we have the economy come apart? It was because Democrats, like Barack Obama, refused to pass and refused to support regulation of the two largest financial institutions in the country, Fannie and Freddie, in July of 2005, after we spent 4 years trying to rein in these gigantic financial institutions, which were highly leveraged. At the end, when they finally collapsed, they were leveraged 70-1, which means that a 1.3% decline in the underlying value of those mortgages that they held would crater those companies and crater our economy. And it was Barack Obama.
And in your appointments to regulatory
Wait a minute. It was the Clinton-era regulator who came in and warned us of this problem, and we spent 4 years. I detail it in the book. I quote all those smart Democrats like Barney Frank and Chris Dodd who said, you know what, don't worry, these institutions are fine and dandy. They had $5.4 trillion worth of mortgage-backed paper. Do you know how much they had when we came into office? 2. They bought $3.4 trillion worth of bad paper while we were trying to regulate them, and it was Democrats, including the now President of the United States, who joined in a filibuster of the regulation in 2005 that they had to vote for in 2008 when these things went under.
Well, he was just a minor player back then.
He was a minor player back then. He was the rising star. He was the keynoter of the Democratic Convention in 2004. You may write him off as a minor player. I think that if he had voted for that, he could have been the vote that would have allowed us to regulate these institutions and keep them from going over the cliff like they did. Between the time that we passed that bill through the Senate Banking Committee in 2005 and the time they went under, these guys went out and bought $1.4 trillion worth of mortgage-backed paper in 3 years. It took them 62 years to get their first $2 trillion.
This is the last thing on this point. This is a diversion because, as you know, the trillions that we had to borrow to pay for tax cuts and a war that wasn't paid for put us in the ditch that we're in right now.
You know what?
Is that not true?
No.
We're not in the ditch?
We grew the economy. We're getting in the ditch because your president is going to pile more debt up in the first 20 months and 11 days of his time in office. It is your president who presented to the Congress last year a plan to double the size of the national debt in 5 years and nearly triple it in 10. With all due respect, you cannot walk in. You know what your president did? In the middle of the fiscal year, he comes into office and he insists upon an increase, apart from the stimulus bill, in the middle of the fiscal year of an 8% increase in discretionary non-security spending, and then proposes a budget that on that new baseline increases at 12%. So he has increased discretionary non-security spending in 1 year between January 20th when he came in and the beginning of the new fiscal year by 25%. How long is it going to take to double the size of the government if you're dramatically increasing spending like that?
3 years.
3 years.
And one other point I want to make, and I'm going to go to another topic, was Chris Dodd and others were getting sweetheart mortgage deals at the same time they fell asleep on mortgaging.
And
the mortgage
Barack Obama
interest.
may have opposed these reforms because he was the third largest recipient of campaign contributions from Fannie and Freddie executives in his 2004 Senate race.
And wasn't it like a retirement home for old Democratic hacks
and look,
politicians?
It was also, let's be honest about it, a retirement home for Republicans who wanted to get greedy.
Okay.
Because look, I had one Republican staffer from Capitol Hill tell friends of mine and tell me that when he left Capitol Hill, he immediately got a call from Fannie and Freddie saying, "We want to hire you, $500,000 a year." Well, he said, "What do I have to do for that?" They said, "We'll let you know." They bought every piece of influence they could. And they were a government-sponsored enterprise. The Congress chartered them. They're this quasi-public-private thing. They get traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Their executives get rewarded with huge stock portfolios and big checks. And yet at the same time, they got the implicit promise of the taxpayers that they'll bail them out.
And they did.
And they did. And they borrowed money at 50 basis points less than the private competitors because of that implicit promise of the taxpayer support.
And still were unsuccessful.
Wrong. And unsuccessful. And they were unsuccessful because they got greedy. They kept saying, we got to chase even high. We get compensated by how big our profits are, not how we fulfill a social purpose. And so they were the guys who facilitating the liar loans and the zero down and no interest. I mean, this is just
pathetic.
Pathetic, exactly.
All right, let me talk to you about governing versus campaigning, because your experience, most of your experience in your life has been politics.
Right.
You had your own firm. You were there at the beginning with the Republican Party in Texas. You were running the campaigns. You were doing the direct mail. I remember.
Yeah, but also,
he is no myth, is what he's trying to say.
Well, look, I also worked in
Hands-on.
Congress, and I also worked in the state legislature.
Oh, you also,
of
course, you were a national young Republican
college
chair.
Republican
college
chair,
Republican
but,
chair.
But you know, if the point is, I spent most of my time in politics. Yeah, but
yeah.
I
So
had
my
some
question
government
is right. But my question is, what's the difference between did you find in your experience between campaigning and governing?
You know, the White House is particularly an interesting place because there are, by precedent and practice, procedures in place that presidents come and go of different parties, but they continue to use them. And so what was interesting to me was this process of governing in which you really do. I mean, it's even more complicated than a governor's office. If you have a presidential speech, for example, there may be 30 or 40 people who have to comment on that speech. If you have a policy-making process, you may start with what's called a deputies meeting, where you have people from all the various agencies discuss an issue, and then they work the issue through and find the areas of agreement and find the areas of disagreement, bring it to a group of the principals, that may be the cabinet secretaries and senior White House staff, and then that eventually gets carried to the president, many times in person, sometimes in paper. And it was a very complicated process, and it well serves a president who honors that process and nurtures the kind of things necessary to make it successful.
You got tagged as being a guy that organizes leaks and the like, and you've received a lot of scrutiny for some behind-the-scenes machinations that you're not necessarily guilty of, I understand.
Wasn't it interesting that it turned out to be the Undersecretary of State who leaked the name of the CIA agent and who had no exposure for having done so?
What intrigued me about the leak analysis as it relates to you, Karl, is you're conceding or admitting and being proud of it that you organized a leak that distracted the press from looking at Dick Cheney when he was about to be picked as vice president, and you sicked them on Mr. Danforth.
Right.
And they followed it.
Right.
So my question is, why is it so difficult for people to, why do you think it's not difficult for people to see that you would have been involved in organizing the leak that outed the CIA officer?
Well, first of all,
whose husband had
first of all,
just been in the New York Times saying that Bush lied.
David, with all due respect, the record shows that her name was leaked by Undersecretary of State Richard Armitage, not me.
Well, but you admitted doing it to a reporter.
Yeah, but you know what? At that point, you didn't know about it. You didn't know that I'd given to a colleague. Remember, I didn't leak to the reporter when in the instance you're talking about Jack Danforth. What I did was I told a staffer whom I knew was prone to leaking that I gave him or her misdirection, and they carried it forward to the press. So it's I
think you're the architect, Karl.
I relied upon the weakness of somebody who is prone to talk to the press, to misdirect the press. I readily admit it.
Well, here's a theory about that chapter where you talk about the lie that Bush lied about the war. Here is my case that's never been made before that I know of about why he actually had to.
He had to lie?
He had to. And the reason is...
This is in David's world.
Well,
fantasy land.
No one wouldn't feel responsible about 9/11 when it happens on their watch, regardless of their participation
David,
or failures.
This is appalling. I would
No
suggest you should not go down this road.
I think everybody would feel bad about what happened.
Ted Kennedy felt badly about 9/11, which caused him to say Saddam had WMD. Bob Graham felt badly about it. John Kerry, John Edwards, Jay Rockefeller, Jane Harmon, the 66 Democrats who stood up on the floor of the House or Senate during the debate on the authorization of the use of force resolution, they all felt bad about 9/11.
You're getting ahead of me.
Hillary Clinton felt bad about it. Bill Clinton felt bad about it. Al Gore, all of whom said Saddam had a WMD, and they did this because they had to lie because they felt badly about 9/11.
You're way ahead of me. What I'm saying is that after 9/11, in May of the following year, you lost the Senate. That means there's an agency. Mr. Jeffords switched.
That was in May of 2001, months before 9/11. You got your chronology wrong.
Right before 9/11, my apologies. Then, as we know, 9/11 happened, and the Senate is in the control of another party, and they have the duty to investigate. So how is it that you can take their minds off of complicity in 9/11, but to have
David, with all due respect,
a new war
I don't know you.
in Iraq?
I, with all due respect, that's insane. To suggest that the President of the United States took us to war because he was concerned about Tom Daschle having a one-vote margin in the United States Senate. David, with all due respect, that's just nutty.
Well, there wasn't any gathering imminent threat.
Yes, it was. Right. You know what, David? If he lied about it, then I just quoted you a lot of Democrats who said Saddam Hussein had WMD. In fact, a lot of whom, like Bob Graham, Democrat chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, who wrote the president a letter signed by Democrats and Republicans alike saying it represents a grave threat. You go read what John Edwards and John Kerry and Hillary Clinton said on the floor of the Senate. You read what Jay Rockefeller, a ranking Democrat on Senate Intel, said about WMD, and then you come back to me and you tell me with a straight face that you think we went to war simply because those people and the president somehow or another felt concerned about the Democrats having a one-vote seat in the Senate. With all due respect, that's just insane.
Did they not get the same intelligence the
Sure
president
they did.
had?
The same national intelligence estimate.
I'm not interested in what politicians
right,
thought.
It's my turn.
The foreign secretary of Great Britain said he was not
a threat
on the Downing Street memo.
You know what?
Yes.
I disagree. The decision of the British government was, do you think Tony Blair said, I'm going to commit Great Britain to an effort to oust Saddam Hussein because he didn't think he was a threat? With all due respect, I simply don't think that passes muster.
I think he lost some arguments.
I have a question.
Oh, and so we can order the Brits around. They don't have an independent judgment of their own.
I want to talk
You're
about.
Underestimating David.
I said we'll let David go back to Fantasyland.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Bush's relationship with Bob Bullock, and then the fact that when Bush got to Washington, you never were able to find the equivalent Bullock, a Democrat who worked with him.
Well, it wasn't just Bullock. It was Bullock, Laney, and I think there is, or was, at least when in the late 90s, a bipartisan spirit in the House and Senate in Texas, because Bush was able not only to work with those two leaders, which were absolutely vital to success in getting this package through, but also with individual legislators. And that didn't exist, particularly after the 2000 election. It just simply didn't exist in Washington.
After 9/11, did you all try to find anyone who'd work with you?
Oh, sure, absolutely. In fact, I talk about an incident after 9/11 involving Dick Gephardt. Dick Gephardt famously refused to say, in response to two questions by Tim Russert on Meet the Press before Bush's inaugural, that Bush was the legitimately elected president of the United States. After 9/11, I recount an episode in there in which the president is in Chicago, and we welcome the opportunity to fly back to Washington with Dick Gephardt. We invite him to come up and fly back to Washington. Bush believes that there needs to be a stimulus package to generate economic growth in the aftermath of 9/11, and Gephardt is a skeptic about it. So Bush brings him aboard the plane and talks to him and says, here's what I think we ought to do, and here's why I think we ought to do it. And Bush is not a guy with a lot of guile. So he literally lays out his cards and says, I've told my economic guys, give me the best things to do to grow the economy. And they say, here are the four things. Number one thing to get the economy going is cut the corporate tax rate. One of the highest in the industrialized world. Companies will price it immediately. They'll be able to create jobs. And Gephardt says, my guys can't go for that. Here's what they can go for. We get back to the White House. The president calls Larry Lindsey and says, take out the corporate tax rate and put Gephardt's idea into the package. I want him to know that I listen to him. I hear you that this is not as powerful economically, but I want him to know that I'm listening to him in the place that we are as a country today. We release the package. Gephardt goes out and attacks it. And to me, it was a sign of how difficult and how raw those emotions were. They remained that way. I'm convinced the attack on Bush on July 15th and July 16th of 2003 about lying on WMD, which is launched by Kennedy within a speech, Daschle in a news conference, the next day Edwards in comments in a committee hearing, Kerry in a speech, and Jane Harman in a news release. I'm convinced this was all done so they could say, let's defeat him in a time of war. All 5 of us have said Saddam had WMD, but what the heck, let's say he lied about it and hope that they don't push back. And
quick
we made a
political
mistake.
question. Can Rick Perry lose in November of 2010?
Look, if you take it for granted, Texas is still a competitive state, and you can't take it for granted as a Republican or a Democrat.
So what does Perry have to do?
Well, emphasize his record, campaign aggressively, take nothing for granted, and he's not. I mean, I was in Dallas recently, and they said, who do you think is going to win the election? I said, Perry. The newspaper reporter said, Rove said with no explanation, Perry. Well, the reason I couldn't explain was everybody stood up and cheered at the World Affairs Council in Dallas. So he's not taking it for granted, and neither the people are supporting
Well, we can't take it for granted either, Carl.
Right.
Time is up.
Thank
you so much for being here.
And stop him from drinking that swamp water. It's really a problem.
You can view tonight's show and a follow-up discussion by going to HoustonPBS.org and looking at Red, White, and Blue, so check that out. Until next time, read Carl's book and get active.